Great. So thank you everyone for coming along today, and to everyone who's online. And welcome to the first panel of today. We're going to be discussing the interplay between politics and antitrust. In order to do that, I'm really excited that I'm joined by a very distinguished panel. At the end, we have Filippo Lancieri. So Filippo is a postdoctoral researcher at ETH Zurich. He's also a research fellow at the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and an associate editor of the Journal of Competition Law and Economics. Next to him is Geoffrey Manne. Jeff needs no introduction, but he's the president and founder of the ICLE. He's also a distinguished fellow at Northwestern University's Center on Law, Business and Economics, and an expert in the economic analysis of law. Next to him is Francisco Marcos, professor of law at IE Law School. So Paco is an expert in the economic analysis of law, as well as commercial and competition law. And he's worked as an independent consultant for the World Bank, the European Commission, and the Asian Development Bank. And then next to me here is Barak Orbach. Barak is the Robert H. Mundheim Professor of Law and Business at the University of Arizona, where he serves as the founding director of the Business Law Program. His areas of expertise are antitrust, corporate governance, regulation, and the digital economy. So we're going to discuss a variety of topics today, and hopefully have some time for some audience interaction at the end. So if I can ask people already to start thinking of some questions, that would be sort of great. But to kick us off, so I'm a private practice lawyer, working on cases like the Microsoft acquisition of Activision and investment in OpenAI. So I guess my personal perspective as a practitioner is that antitrust enforcement has become increasingly politicized. Does the panel share that perspective? Has there been a change? And if so, why? So Filippo, I'm going to ask you to kick us off on that.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone, and thank you, Jeff, Lazar, Dirk, everyone from the ICLE, also from Universidad Carlos Madrid for the invitation. It's truly a pleasure to be here. I think that's undeniable, right? It's something that is very hard to everywhere you look. I think that's true. I think the real interesting question is whether this is bad. And I think there the discussion becomes more interesting. So I'll tell you a small anecdote. So when I first started learning antitrust law, and I'm not that old, I'm 34, but bear with me because that's exactly the point. So when I first started learning antitrust law in Brazil, this was around 2006, I had an excellent teacher, actually, that's the reason why I'm here. But it's impressive that we would only really look at Brazilian law and US law. So we looked at the United States, like the United States antitrust regime, as if really Americans had figured it all out. Like we would read like Sylvania and Liggin and Trinco and say like, oh, that's the reference. They really discovered how to do it. And with all respect to Europeans, I'd never even heard about Digicomp, sorry, almost, that was not in the picture. They were like, yeah, there's Europeans, they do something over there, but the Americans really figured it out. And then with time, this was due to an incredible policy stability, right? So if you look at the antitrust from the 90s until 2015, it's amazing how stable the policy was. We had discussions on reverse patent settlements and things like this, but overall, the whole structure was really stable. And reached a point where Judge Posner in a Stigler conference, someone asked me about antitrust, and he said, antitrust is actually a dead policy, isn't it? Like there's nothing going on there. Like why are we even talking about it? Where I think this changed is that we started seeing cracks in this technocratic system, first with the 2008 financial crisis, which showed that kind of like this aura of technocratics implementing policy and just leading to the common good show that this not always works. And then afterwards, we started seeing the aftermath of the financial crisis, more and more evidence showing that the policy was simply not delivering as it was supposed to deliver, right? You started seeing that markups are up, concentration is up, the labor share of profits is down, business dynamism is down, productivity is down, average salaries are completely stagnant over 30, 40 years. At the moment that this notion of stability, that antitrust is this technocratic policy that just delivers what it's supposed to deliver, the facade broke or the facade disappear, then what you see is that people with their different priorities and questions of what they think are interesting problems for society, and I think the keynote explained this very well, start introducing the topics that they care about, So, and the topics that they think are important for society as well, saying antitrust should do more for the society that is supposed to serve. And then part of the discussion is interesting that this is a conference on the outer boundaries of antitrust law, because antitrust has always been political, no? That's the definition. So in a way, the outer boundaries is the past 30 years, but politics and democracy came back, but also sustainability came back because of the environmental crisis that we face. Topics around the industrial policy came back because industrial policy is reviving. And I think that's exactly the topic that we're going to be discussing throughout the day today. But yeah, I think the antitrust is more political, and that probably that's a good thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's how I would answer your question.
Barak, do you agree with that sort of analysis of where we are, that antitrust has basically failed, and now there is a political debate about where we go from here?
Well, I think that there's a lot of noise. I don't think that overall the direction will change considerably. Much of the noise is based on interesting historical narratives that are closer to the Department of Fiction than history. But overall, if we look at antitrust, it's about competition. We can try to add it to other things, but our knowledge of markets and economics has evolved considerably even over the past 30-some years. So we have learned a lot. Markets have evolved a lot. We need to evolve. So there shouldn't be any dispute that we live in a new economy. We have to adjust. The notion that we should now, that because we need to adjust, we can now go to ignore expertise and use intuitions and have a public discourse whether the acquisition of Activision Blizzard should be approved or not. I don't think that the public discourse is a way to analyze mergers. So we see a lot of noise. I think that part of that is because there are a lot of a lot of social grievances that politicians have been exploiting in all countries. But at the end of the day, the public will move on, lose interest in antitrust, and only us geeks will continue to be interested in antitrust 5 years down the road. The history shows us that, every now and then there's some excitement, and then at the end, only us remain interested in that. And this is where the political aspect of antitrust will fade away, and politicians will move to talk about other things, whatever that would be at the moment.
Jeff, do you see political interest fading away in antitrust, leaving us geeks here to debate this?
Well, I don't want to prognosticate too much. I mean, I'm very pessimistic by nature, so I don't see the future looking bright. But my definition of bright is a little bit different than Filippo's. I mean, I guess to your question, I don't know for sure if it's gotten more political in the sense that antitrust enforcers have always had discretion. There's always been a scarcity of time relative to the number of cases. So they're always, selecting cases on the basis of something. And I think it's literally impossible to somehow force them to do that only on the basis of narrow economic concerns or something like that. There's a reason that enforcement patterns change a little bit in the US anyway, with different administrations. So I think politics is always, and I would say any company that's ever been the subject of a merger investigation is certain that there's a political vendetta against them, and that's the basis for it, right? I mean, so what's different, I think, is sort of the legitimizing of the political discourse, the political decision making, and I don't think there's any reason to be approving of that. I think we have to understand at the very least that we have different sorts of political institutions, right? We have more and less democratic institutions. All of our modern democratic governments are mixed governments of various sorts. I don't think anyone ever created, and certainly the rules around enforcement agencies were not built to be responsive to democratic concerns, directly responsive to the people or something like that, right? We have a whole host of institutions that govern these agencies, these institutions. And I think it's really dangerous to without changing the institutional structure, just come along and say, well, we can go ahead and change the relatively narrow mandate you used to have. Let's just change that to an utterly broad one with essentially no constraints placed on it in an environment in which you already have massive amounts of discretion, limited judicial review, insulation from political effects, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we understand rent seeking, we understand, public choice economics. I mean, I think we should be really wary of that kind of a shift. I'll shut up in a second. I think, in particular, I think it's important to not abandon the technocratic nature of these entities. That's how they were conceived. That's how the rules around them have developed. And I mean, I'll be the first to be absolutely critical of every technocratic decision that any government has ever taken, probably. But relative to the alternative in which you have so there's a quote from Rana Foroohar recently in the Financial Times where she talks about the kitchen table economics and how the popularization of antitrust is part of a larger shift. While the economic policy discussions are increasing the purview of lawyers, activists, and ordinary people, these people are less interested in technocratic debates about market mechanisms than in a grassroots discussion about how corporate power has distorted the market in ways that they find absurd. I find it absurd to think that that's the basis on which we should be making antitrust decisions. That's not to say that there isn't, of course, a political overlay, that there isn't a role for the legislature, that there isn't a role in, for individual decision makers who are put in a position where they have discretion. I mean, we're trusting them to make decisions based on whatever they want to make decisions on. But if we say we're going to replace the technocratic nature of this with feelings, I mean, we're just it's a hellish road. And I thought Pilar's talk this morning did a great job of talking about this. And it's not to say that there is no possibility that antitrust enforcement could take account of, for example, sustainability. But there's there's sort of some guardrails you would want to put on that, not least of which is that you would want that to happen in the context in which you're still trying to maximize consumer welfare. And I think that's an inherently sort of economic and technocratic calculation if it's just based on what some people who may have political power or who may just have a soapbox, if it's based on what their preferences are, antitrust is meaningless. So I would worry about the increase in politicization, and I would say I don't know that there's an increase in politicization. I'm sure it's always been there, but there's certainly been a kind of legitimizing of it, and that's very dangerous.
Filippo, I'm just going to let you come back in and comment on whether the recent changes or the progressive view of antitrust is a replacement of economics by feelings.
I don't think, actually, I mean, it's interesting because I don't disagree with most of what Geoff and Barak said. I think that no one is proposing that we should decide mergers by referenda. Like, that's not what is in proposition here. It's not like, oh, do you like or dislike the Microsoft Activision merger? And then you put it to a vote and people say yes or no, and then you do 50%, 50.1% we block it. I think what part of the people are saying is that special interests thrive in quiet politics. And the notion that we live, that the consumer welfare standard that prevailed during the 90s and the early 2000s was just the enlightenment that came from technocrats, and they solved all problems in antitrust by establishing this single, extremely objective criteria that is subject to all forms of different influences, including lobbying, by the way. There's good studies showing that even in the height of the consumer welfare standard, companies that lobby more got easier antitrust approval. So just imagining that this is like the acumen of what we reach and that there's no way to adapt it, I think is not real. And I also think that part of the discussion is exactly about changing goals through democratic processes, right? We're talking about changing laws, passing different laws, appointing regulators and politicians who have different enforcement priorities. So in all these aspects, I actually don't disagree with Geoff or Barak at all. I think that's true. But I think that, yeah, I'll close here and I'll let people follow.
Yeah, I guess just to share a story. So you mentioned that we're not deciding mergers through democratic processes. And I'm always a bit wary about sort of equating social media with democracy, but there is a real trend in Europe towards increasing use of social media. So if I give you an example on the Microsoft Activision case, the CMA has gone out to consumers and asked their views, both through Twitter, which is probably a little bit and discredited as a medium of doing that, but and through a sort of an online survey, they got 2,500 responses, of which about 2,000 were in support of the deal. They were promptly ignored by the CMA, so it was quite an interesting sort of process. But this how do regulators deal with social media is a really live issue. But when we come to Europe, Paco, I'm just going to let Paco come in and give a European perspective, and then Jeff, come back to you.
Should I?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Or give any perspective you want.
No, I mean, I was gonna probably follow what you said before, and but me a little bit more poetic. Lazar didn't tell us what kind of ship is that. What?
No, it's a galley.
No, so the point here is that, is it a fishing ship? Is the ship going to discover the America or something?
Probably. You think it's a warship?
No, could it be a wreck ship? A wreck. Yeah, lost.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
I think, because I think to bring a different perspective, competition authorities, Maria Pilar before said they are prioritizing. I don't know if they are prioritizing. They are fishing whatever they can get. And so what I see now is that they are surviving, not prioritizing. So the idea is some of these new tools may be something that, because can we think that the technocrats are angels, only move themselves by incentives which are pure, and or the public interest, that, as Pilar said. You all said that politicians are behind. So I agree that we may have, Pilar said, this is spurious interest behind sustainability, industrial policy, or whatever, but the idea is that the competition agencies themselves have also inside, the bureaucrats want to survive. And so they come up with these new tools. Like, for example, I think the big thing now in Europe is that we have all these foreign direct investment controls, which has become the new tool for controlling. Definitely is a source of income for lawyers, and also a source of time for the staff working in the competition authorities. But is that really needed? And so I think one of the points here is, if you want to change what competition authorities were supposed to do, you need to change the law. And the problem now here is, if you look at the European Commission, they don't have any more cartels, neither the Spanish Competition Authority. So they need to come up with new things to do. But come on, I mean that's not the way you can do it, but that's,
they look harder.
You think?
Yeah, probably.
I don't know, but the problem is I don't know. So you need to bring new cases. So they're, a factory to bring cases. And especially, for example, now, when I read that the main tool for competition, killing mergers, or is it killing merger control? So we need to come up with new tools to control more mergers. So we have more filings. We have many filings already, and most of mergers are not blocked. So why do we have that? Because lawyers make a lot of money, and economists. Well, probably that's good for all of us. I tell my students, but I don't know if that's good for the public interest. But anyway, probably this is even more pessimistic than you.
It is. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Maria Pilar's not going to be happy with that either.
Jeff, did you want to comment on?
I forgot what I was going to say, but on this point, I do have a comment, if I may, really quickly, which is just that I think. I think there's some real truth to the idea about having to sort of justify your existence, and I don't, that doesn't mean that there isn't also good legitimate separate basis for taking a different approach to competition law. But I do think that the point you raised about sort of counting the number of cases is a real canard, and one of the critiques I have of Filippo's paper with Eric Posner and Luigi Zingales, which is the sort of a lot of the method by which they try to establish that that we have had a sort of a regime of lax enforcement that favors big business over the common man, I guess, is counting cases, and the problem with that, of course, is that it leaves a lot out of the analysis, not least that a small number of cases is just as consistent with a regime that is effectively deterring bad conduct as one that's under enforcing. But at the same time, it also doesn't take account of changes in the law, changes in the nature of remedies, changes in, I mean, some of these are mentioned in your paper, and I don't mean, I mean, I do mean to single you out because you're here, but you know, but it's not just you. And I think that for some reason, I think a lot of I think it's interesting what Paco said, because I do think that it's too easy. It's a good example of why you should be more technocratic. It's too easy to say, well, we aren't bringing enough cases. That's how we know that we're under enforcing our antitrust laws. And unfortunately, that resonates with a lot of people who don't know better. And that strikes me as problematic unless you've already decided you simply want more cases for the sake of having more cases. And so providing more mechanisms by which antitrust enforcers can defend bringing more cases doesn't seem necessarily a good thing. So
I just want to make a comment about the word technocracy. So in academia, people like to argue a lot, and the stakes are low, so you can waste your entire time in terms of arguing. But the essence of technocracy is that if you actually want to win through the legal system, you have to follow the rules. The legal rules, whatever they might be, the procedures, the substance, etc. If you cannot follow the rules, you are not going to win any case. And if you have an administrative agency that doesn't operate according to rules, it doesn't follow the rule of law. So what people like to condemn as technocracy, it is just the operation of legal institutions. Now, in the public discourse or in the newspapers, people might think that this is really tedious, and they are absolutely right about that. But so long as we use legal institutions, there must be some technocracy. And it is absolutely true that legal rules are never perfect. They can always be improved. But the notion is that we can just get rid of all these things and now kind of dance together and sing the kumbaya and all problems will be resolved. I just don't think that this is operational. Now, historically, what happened with technocracy is that whenever there is a new school of thought, they condemned the prior school of thought as technocrats, some kind of bureaucrats, and said, oh, we have something better. And so they will see one change of technocracy with another change of technocracy, and that's fine. But it should be quite clear, technocracy is important because we are talking about legal institutions.
I think you've taken us on to the next topic, which is a really important one. So, you know, one of the things that I think is now coming out of the debate, the shift from one paradigm to the next, particularly in the US, is this idea that market power itself can lead to political power, and that this sort of build-up of political power through economic power is actually potentially undermining democracy. And that's a big debate, you know, in the US. I think it's one that we're probably less familiar with here in Europe. It seems quite radical, but it is, you know, it is a sort of a big debate. And it really comes back to this idea almost, you know, is big bad? So I guess just, you know, Jeff, you touched on this and you touched on Filippo's paper earlier, but I don't know if you want to try and unpack that a little bit for a European audience.
sure. Well, I will be the one to characterize Filippo's paper instead of Filippo characterizing it. That way I get the well, no, he can respond. That's, you know, he wrote the paper already. So
and it's quite long though, so
it is, yeah. So I think this argument that economic power, I mean, I'm not necessarily putting words into Filippo's mouth, but I think I'll characterize it as economic power leads inexorably to the exercise of political power, and that this is destructive of our democracy, that it's the fault of lax antitrust enforcement that has allowed this, and lax antitrust enforcement is a function of the abuse of the antitrust system by big business that has sort of, you know, co-opted the system to favor itself at the expense of the people. And I think every element of that is wrong. I mean, empirically and even theoretically. And it's not to say that it's not possible, of course. I mean, you know, crony capitalism is a real thing, and it's bad. And of course, companies are, you know, far from from angels, and they'll do whatever they can to try to take advantage of the system. I mean, the sort of the underlying theory in that regard is absolutely correct, but the notion that it somehow is tied to the size of the firms and the amount of concentration in their markets is, I mean, I think it's really far-fetched, and I'm not. I know I have somewhat limited time, and unless Filippo starts to go into the details, I'm not going to go into all the details. But the empirical literature does not support the claim at all. There's almost no relationship between market capitalization and lobbying expenditures, which is one of the mechanisms by which this is supposed to happen. The absolute level of lobbying, at least in the U.S., is extraordinarily low. And I know Luigi acknowledges this in his earlier paper. I don't remember if you guys mentioned this in the current paper. It suggests that the potential benefits from rent seeking are a little bit lower than we might think. This is the Tulloch effect. And one of the things that becomes true, given that, is the notion that, so one of the arguments that explains why only larger firms have this kind of political power and the ability to influence the system in their favor, is because they can afford to. Well, it turns out that it's just not that expensive to lobby. I mean, I did a quick look at the sort of lobbying charts a couple of years ago, and I don't remember now exactly, but if you looked at sort of the amounts that companies were spending, or that, let's also point out, the biggest spenders are often not companies, they're associations. The American Medical Association, for example, is always one of the biggest lobbyists in the US. I suspect that their interests are diametrically opposed with many of the big companies that are also lobbying. But in any case, the amount that's spent just on lobbying is something that if you took if you sort of assume a rate of return and amount of profits for firms, something like the top, I think I calculated like the top 7,000 public firms. No, that's not right. It was lower than that. It was like the top 1,000 firms could easily afford this, just as a simple basic cost of doing business. I think I assumed that they would want to that they wouldn't spend more than 10% of their profits on this, and that if you limit it to that, many firms can lobby the government. It's not really limited to just the biggest firms. And then, of course, there's the question whether it has any effect at all, and this goes to the Tulloch effect point. It's the only thing we can measure is how much firms are spending on lobbying. So first of all, it turns out there's not a correlation between the size of the firm and the amount they're spending on lobbying. And you can see it in the charts. It's, I mean, the R squared is, if you're on Twitter, on Econ Antitrust Twitter, R squared is a good joke, but I mean, it's basically zero. But you also have no idea what the effectiveness is. Just because a company spends a lot of money on lobbying doesn't mean that they're actually being effective with it. And I don't think there's anyone that has been able to actually measure the sort of effectiveness. I don't know of any papers that have actually tried to measure this effectiveness question, but you can imagine a lot of things other than the size of your firm that would actually determine how effective you are at lobbying. And we all know examples of very small firms that have been very successful in affecting enormous redistributions of wealth to themselves by the government, and it's not a function of their size. As a theoretical matter, also, it's not clear why we should think that large firms and concentrated industries are more likely to be lobbying the government and influencing the government. I mean, there is this like superficial logic to it. That you're big, so the government knows you're there. You have, you're sort of a presence, and they're interacting with you, and but the reality is that on the one hand, while you might think that these large firms have more money and more ability to lobby, they also may have much less interest in lobbying, because the main reason for lobbying the government, typically for firms that are sort of trying to capture the government for their benefit, is to harm their competitors and protect themselves against competition. Well, if you don't have very much competition, you don't have to do very much of that. If you are already dominating your market, and let's say it is in fact a monopolized market, and you're able to charge super competitive profits, what's the point of lobbying government to try to do what? To make sure that you can charge slightly higher super competitive profits? I mean, it's, the point is that at the margin, there's a smaller incentive actually to lobby. Now, the sort of exception to this, and there's a little bit of weak empirical evidence on this, is when you become larger and you're worried about government enforcement, and you're trying to lobby against, and this is a large part of the argument in Filippo's paper, is that the notion, the Chicago school that has sort of said we should be careful, be cautious about how much we intervene in these markets, is really just a big business sort of, masquerading, trying to protect itself against government and antitrust enforcement. I've talked for a long time, so I won't keep going on this, but this also doesn't hold water at all. The notion that this is a sort of businesses acting as crony capitalists and sort of co-opting an entire theory, it has also no empirical or theoretical basis, which I can talk about later, but I'm sorry, I rambled. So,
Filippo, is there any empirical evidence in your paper?
I mean, I don't want to discuss my paper in particular because it's focused on the US, but we're here to, it's supposed to be entertaining. So I'll say that I fundamentally disagree with what Geoff just said. And I think that the notion that market power leads to political power is self-evident in a way. Like the notion that the term banana republic was coined because banana companies controlled Costa Rica and Honduras back then, and they had incredible political power through the extraction of economic power. Plutocracy and crony capitalism, like we're fighting a war in Ukraine now because there's a country that's controlled by economic elites who also, guess what, control the political system as well. And this is the foundation of antitrust enforcement. Like the European system of antitrust enforcement is based on the ordoliberal tradition and the Freiburg School in Germany. That literally comes out of a diagnosis that the creation of cartels and of market power in Germany facilitated the rise of Hitler. Here, there's an excellent paper by Daniel Crane and Alexandre Ruiz-Fizes, who looks at Franco in Spain and finds like similar dynamics as well. I come from Brazil. In Brazil, the entire car wash operation, which is one of the largest antitrust investigations and anti-corruption investigations in the world, rises from the concentration in the meat packing and civil construction industry. And that basically companies realized that as the market got more concentrated, they could organize cartels. And then once they organized the cartel, they could then lobby the government and use the government to get better grants and contracts and other forms of subsidies. So I think, in a way, what Geoff is describing is just something that I think is potentially, I think is actually true, is that lobbying data is a terrible proxy for political power. Like what you do is that you lobby at some level, the lobbying grants you access. There's this excellent declaration by Brad Smith from Microsoft, where he basically says it's like, you just need to lobby enough that you're in the room. But the sources of political power go much further than only money. Money is one of the sources. One of the things that we document, for example, in our paper, is that starting the 1980s, 66% of FTC and DOJ commissioners, as soon as they retire, they go work for the Defense Bar Association of Antitrust. 66, and that's not counting the people who are professors, but then they also consult for the Defense Bar. So the notion that somehow kind of money is not aligned with antitrust enforcement, I think that this is just a failure of the lobbying data. But even within the lobbying data, if you look at like area like Pratt and Valetti have a new paper with Gotshal, what they look is that they look at every single merger in the US in the 1990s and political contributions. And what they find is that mergers, this is causally identified, so it's data that Geoff would like. Mergers, after the merger, companies increase their lobbying expenditures by 21%. So that's their finding. You have a new paper that's very interesting on trade policy, and you see that like once you have a trade shock that happened in the US with the entry of China, as companies felt more threatened by competition, what did they do? They increased their lobbying. Where did they increase their lobbying? They increased their lobbying in antitrust enforcement as well. They want to weaken antitrust enforcement. So I think that, again, the notion that market power is somehow connected to political power is like, it's self-evident and is well established in any area of political sciences and other areas. I think where we do have a question, and I think it's a fair question, and I think Geoff and I would agree, is that we don't know yet at what level this becomes a problem. And this is something that's relevant because exactly, I don't disagree with any of you, like antitrust is at some level a technocratic enforcement, and it should be. Like it's a complex policy with complex trade-offs. We don't want to have referenda mergers. And so we need to have more data to understand exactly at what level, specific levels, is it something that wants to have, like, I don't know, is it something connected only to size? So Nolan McCarthy has a very good paper looking at lobby data and concentration, and they don't find a clear relationship between market concentration measured at the NCAES 4 level and political expenditures. They do find a correlation, very high correlation between the size of the company and their lobby expenditures itself. So you look at like the Fortune 500. So we don't know exactly if it's more connected to size than is connected to market power itself. And this has implications for antitrust enforcement because you could think of a policy that says, oh, if it is really connected to market power, then you should really incorporate this analysis in every single merger. If it's something that's more connected to size, then maybe what you need to have is something that's more connected to like the top 100 firms have more restrictions or things like that. But I think we'll get to that. But again, I think the notion that political power and market power are somehow connected is really pretty self-evident when you look around the world, you know.
Barak, I want to bring you in here. I mean, is big as bad, or big companies actually trying to comply?
So I think that the argument is a little bit soft, to be honest, because one thing that we tend to underestimate is the relationship between capitalism and democracy. They do not exist. They are always interdependent. They do not exist independently in nature. So if you have good, healthy capitalism, it will be in a democratic regime. And if you have democracy that is stable and healthy, it will be in a capitalistic market. Now, it is true that there was a period in which the United States was very imperialistic in terms of trying to export democracy and capitalism to countries that were neither capitalistic or no democratic. It had some benefits, but overall, it was not a replication of the United States. Having said that, because of that part, and because of actually large corporations in the US do understand that, we would not have had civil rights in the United States without lobbying of big corporations. The civil rights today in the United States, not today, in this century, have been literally funded by big companies. And the reason we see a breakup between the Republican Party and big corporate in the United States is because the present politics of the Republican Party is not consistent with what corporate America think that should be civil rights. So I think that it's really easy. Of course, when you have more money, you could accomplish more. But when we look at how companies actually use it, and if you interact a lot with corporate directors, the number one, what people call sustainability in this conference, what the way corporate directors think about it is disruptive risk. For businesses, certainty is important, and sustainability is one aspect, but another aspect is the stability of the political regime, what kind of social discontent we have or do not have. And for businesses, what actual directors talk about when they think about ESG, they think about, well, where are we going to be 20 years from down the road? And this is what they try to accomplish. So if someone is really serious about the harm of corporate lobbying, that person should think really hard about civil rights and democracy. We will not have that without corporate policies of the 20th century. It's very different from the 20th century. And I think it's when I look at company, I say, well, you could see this is a 20th century company or this is a 21st century company. But overall, when we look at the lobbying, right now, our democracy and civil rights heavily depend on massive spending of corporations. Whether we like it or dislike it, we do not have an alternative at this point.
I think there also, it should be noted that just, I don't know if any of I can't remember if the Valetti study tries to disambiguate sort of the level of spending in general, or if there's any way to actually determine whether it's focus on antitrust.
I mean, it's an intra-company study, right?
What?
It's a within company treatment study. So they're basically looking at what companies do before and after mergers, like events.
Well, right. But they aren't looking at what the money is being spent on. They're just looking at an overall spend, right? My point is just to say, I mean, there are lots of reasons, sort of similar to what Barak was saying. We have a massive, complicated regulatory state in the U.S. The size of the federal regulations increases by, I don't know by what number every year. And that doesn't, personally, I'm not thrilled with that, but regardless, it's just sort of a fact that it's more and more complicated to comply with the law. If you're a company that's just merged, for example, and you now all of a sudden are doing business in 4 states instead of 1, of course you'd expect their lobbying expenditures to increase. They're now subject to a whole new sets of regulations. So this is why I asked in the study whether.
But this is different, right? What they're showing is like you have 2 companies, they lob they lob 2, so they have the same operations. Once they merge, the size of the operation is the same. Now they lob 2.2. So, and then again, there's one thing. Second thing, then you're agreeing with me that as companies get bigger, they touch more markets, then they lobby more. So basically, there is a connection between growth, size, market power, and lobbying.
Barak is right that you can't assume that that's a bad thing. I guess that was sort of my point.
Can I ask something as a humble European? No, because, I don't know anything about this. I'm not a digital guy, but if companies lobby, why are you all assuming that they lobby in the same direction? Like Qualcomm probably is having a different lobbying strategy than Apple. And so that will, in a way, counteract, right? No?
No, that's true, but that's exactly why we like market competition, right? So the whole, I totally agree with Barak that capitalism and democracy are intertwined. The problem is that as markets get more concentrated and you have less competitors, then you don't have people lobbying two directions. You have people lobbying one direction. And that's exactly the foundation of the problem. If antitrust fails and markets become incredibly concentrated, then you don't have countervailing lobby. I'm a big fan of companies fighting each other, but if there's only one company in the market, then it's not going to lobby against itself.
There's always a countervailing. Oh, you're right. If there's only one, I mean, to your point about fascism, and if there's only one firm, that might be true. That just doesn't happen to describe virtually any market that we're concerned with in the world today. Like the digital markets, none of these markets have just one player. And I certainly think that for example, just out of the blue, Epic Games, for example, is a smaller company than Microsoft, Google, and Apple, and yet I would submit that its lobbying has been far more effective than those companies. Now I don't know that to be true. I shouldn't say that. It's certainly been effective, and I doubt that you would ever find a situation where you have a dominant company that isn't met with counter lobbying, at the very least from labor unions and other sorts of associations of people who are inevitably in a complementary or competitive relationship with those companies.
Labor unions are disappearing in the US. I just want to mention.
No, I know.
That's another of the problem. I agree with you. I would love if there are a lot of labor unions to counter value firms. Guess what? Another of the data that's going down. Labor unions are going down. So the direction is pretty bad.
So Filippo, what do you think about sort of lobbying by customers or suppliers? Do you think that doesn't have the same effect?
I mean, it could have. So we have when we prepared this report at the Stigler Center, which was looking at digital markets, and it's interesting because most people know the antitrust report. Very fewer people know that there is also a report on political dynamics. And the idea was exactly to understand what are the sources of political power, right? And basically what we argued there is that you can imagine 5 key sources of political power as sources of company power. So one of them is just money and monetary, like there's a fixed cost to lobbying, revolving doors, etc. Another of them is complexity. So the more complex the firm becomes, the more the information asymmetries between society and the firms, the more likely the firm can influence regulation. And there's a third one, which is just media power. Like if you're the New York Times or if you're TV, you have political power because people are looking at you. And in a way, a lot of digital companies have those as well. Then one of them, which is particularly interesting, is membership, which is ultimately, think of like the, I don't know, association of retired professionals in the US or any kind of union, basically. Basically, what you have is that you have votes and you have organization. So this is a very powerful source of political power. The problem with consumer associations and suppliers is that they're really, really dispersed. And so they have a major collective action problem to organize. And so this is one of the countervailing issues. The second problem is that as markets get more concentrated, companies become more afraid of suing or of lobbying against, like we've seen this with Amazon, and you see this even with like Apple and Epic, that people go there and say, I'm here speaking out. And then the first thing that Apple does is shut down the company and they have to ask for an injunction to be able to continue to exist. So and this is like, they are a multi-billion-dollar firm, imagine how many of the small Apple developers. And we actually had this with, there was a very good CMA, I think there was a very good survey here in Europe where people were looking at digital companies and they asked whether they would be willing to sue or they would be willing to complain. And people said, no, I'm afraid because I'm actually too dependent on Google, like if somehow they kick me out, then I cannot do anything. So I completely agree with you. I think that there are other sources of political power, not only money, and that's exactly why lobbying data is such bad data, right? But the problem is that, again, as markets get more and more and more concentrated, all of these other countervailing forces weaken. And so, again, we don't know exactly at what point this becomes incredibly problematic. I think that like Nazi Germany, where you had cartels for every industry, is definitely the outlier. But it doesn't mean that the whole process of consolidation that's taking place throughout the economy, I mean, in the US, certainly, we're just talking today, it's also increasing in Europe, in other places as well, weakens the countervailing forces. And that's exactly when the link between democracy and capitalism starts to break down.
Let me adjust one point that it's unfair in terms of the balance of power on this table, that you're a little bit relatively only attacked. So it's unfair. We should recognize that. Okay.
I'm
Now, I
happy
think that
to
it's
happy to
really-
be the spare.
It's really. I think we should really be cautious with the historical comparisons because the situation in Germany was really complex, and I don't think that it would be correct to describe Germany of the 1930s as democracy. That's number one. At the same time, in the United States in the 1930s, the federal government actually orchestrated collusions. So, and it's not only the New Deal, but rather from 1914 to the collapse of the New Deal in 1935, the federal government, through Democratic and Republican administration, believed in a vision that was called the associative states, where the cure to illnesses of industrialism would be small civil societies, which in modern language we call them cartels. So it was actually very global. In Germany, it took one form. In the United States, it took a different form. But it wasn't healthy. Nobody suggests that. So in terms of historical parallels, I think we should be really, really cautious. Undoubtedly, the German international cartels were act of genius in terms of war. I mean, they basically were able to shut down the aluminum and steel production in the United States in terms of capacity. They were very strategic about it. I wouldn't extrapolate from that to the situation in the United States right now. So again, I want to say at the abstract level, of course, if you have more money, you can lobby more and you can do more things. However, it would also be a mistake to think that if you can have unlimited money, you could make Congress functional. Because if you're in the United States and you want to secure yourself laws, you ask yourself, whom should I lobby? Because this kind of government is so dysfunctional. I just identify for me to whom I can buy so that that party would pass laws. It's just impossible these days. So I think that, there's a lot to say about that. Of course, the picture is complicated and we should recognize that it is nuanced, but right now, again, as I said, in the entire world, we do have concern about democracy. We do have concern about civil rights. And you want to ask yourself, who is protecting them right now? Is that kind of unions? This is kind of people who have a lot to say on Twitter, or these are kind of companies that have a lot of money to invest in strategic litigation or strategic lobbying, et cetera, et cetera. In the United States, the same-sex marriage was funded by basically strategic litigation of corporate America. So again, it's complicated, but we should not bundle it in one box or multiple. It is in many boxes, and they're messy.
I think if I can add, it's really important to also consider the other side. I don't know which is the demand and which is the supply side, but the supply side of regulation, and it goes to the point about the sort of the historical point. In the 30s, the progressive movement argues, very left-wing historian Gabriel Coco was actually intervened in very competitive markets in the name of protecting people from big business. Big business, of course, immediately leapt on that opportunity to try to use those laws to protect themselves from competition. But the main legacy of that, Coco argues, is the creation of this web of interrelated contacts and the dependency of business on government and government on business. And I think for purposes of this conference, if you think, even if there is you think there's a problem of business having too much influence over politics, I hardly think it's going to be helped by explicitly making politics a bigger part of decision making in antitrust. I think I'm sure we'll talk in the sustainability panel, for example, about the prospect of providing some kinds of protections for cartels that may be, effectively the most effective way of reducing exploitation of common pool resources. If you live in which may be totally fine, but if you live in a world in which you're sort of handing out exceptions to antitrust laws on the basis of sort of non-economic concerns, It's just it's absolutely an invitation for business to come in and try to get themselves exceptions from the antitrust laws. And I guarantee that it seems like the obvious consequence of that would be more concentration rather than any kind of a reduction in concentration. So anyway, I mean, and I know that's sort of pulling together two disparate threads here, but I do think they're related in a really important way.
And Jeff, I think you're raising a really important question, which is, if we think about this sort of interplay between capitalism and democracy, which I think we all accept there is that interplay, do we think we have the tools? Does antitrust have the tools now to preserve a healthy economy and a healthy political debate? Should we be giving antitrust agencies more power or not? Practically, what does this mean for the enforcement sort of, regime going forward? And Barak, I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
Some, not too much, but I would say that one aspect of that is that certain markets perhaps are more important for democracy in terms of competition. So, for example, in media, we might be more cautious about how media market, how news market and information market are organized. And in many countries, what we see is that we have content ecosystems that can emerge in specific niches. So that's example. So it's a niche that is protected from competition from the big ecosystems. And this kind of small content ecosystem could create a huge distortion in public opinion. So that's actually where antitrust could be quite effective. In other things about whether antitrust should be is a tool to protect democracy. I think that if you protect competition, you protect democracy. It's so long as we have vibrant markets, that's what's needed for democracy. Now, easy to say, we all know, those of us who have been there long enough, it's really difficult. And there are many strong debates about what is vibrant competition and what is true, what people thought about in the 1990s, that unless it's merger from 4 to 3 or 3 to 2, it's not competitive. Well, we don't think this way. So we have evolved, or most of us don't think this way. So we have evolved, but I think that again, if we protect antitrust protection, good, healthy antitrust enforcement is good for democracy. Where mistakes made in the past, constantly, hopefully we're moving forward and become better. But other than that, I would not start having additional factors on top of competition itself.
Filippo, if you want to come in, do we have the tools? Do we just need to use them, or do we need new tools?
No, I think we have some tools and we need new tools. Like I totally agree with Geoffrey said and with Barak said as well, that introducing politics leads to more demand and more supply, right? So that's the lesson of the car wash investigation in Brazil. It's like the government realized, like, oh, it's really good if we actually give these companies a lot of money, we can actually extract bribes and support the government. And it became a vicious cycle that was basically, that's why it's an anti-corruption and an anti-cartel investigation, right? There's a clear connection between both. I do think that we have to separate two different processes. One is what would this mean in practice in terms, for example, of merger regimes, for example? And what I think is the key question here is that we are used, and I think that's exactly what the push for this panel is and what the push for other areas are. We are used to thinking as antitrust, as a unitary policy that has one single and explicit goal, which is to improve, to lead to, let's say, increase business efficiency. And everything we look at antitrust is just about business efficiency or like allocative efficiency or whatever. What is really interesting about this notion is that this notion comes from a 1968 paper by Oliver Williamson, where he basically makes the trade-off that everybody sees between that welfare, consumer welfare and then weight loss and etc. And then Williamson says, oh, we should be looking at business efficiency. But then he has this is a small part of the paper, he has a much longer part of this paper. Eric Paz has a great new analysis on this, where basically where Williamson says, like, guess what? If you only look about efficiency as the driver of entire antitrust policies, this is going to lead to a lot of problems. One of them is that firms are going to start acquiring political power. If you have perfect extraction of rents from society, consumers might get really pissed and they might push against antitrust policy. And so I think that we don't have a good notion yet of until what point efficiency alone should drive antitrust, and at what point do we need broader trade-offs. And then these may come in what Barak was saying, that maybe what you need, I think, a clear lesson that comes out of this, that we have to tighten merger review from where it is now. No, I think that this is It's not a consensus, but it's a very low, let's say a near consensus that merger regime over the past 34 years has been incredibly lax, and we need to tighten it up, and this will be aligned. So in some areas, you can just enforce more antitrust, and this is going to have positive spillovers in other areas like politics, like competition. And in some areas, maybe in key industries like media industries, where we really recognize that these are key industries for democracy, then we might need to have explicit tests, which are like, we want to have at least 4 players. And if we have less than 4 players, maybe we're going to pay higher prices, but we are trading off other goods. And then here I agree that who should make these determinations are politicians. They're not primarily the goal of antitrust authorities. The problem is that many times in the past, we have made these determinations and then antitrust steamrolled them. Like a good example is the Robinson-Patman Act in the US. Everybody hates the Robinson-Patman Act. I don't particularly like the Robinson-Patman either. The Robinson-Patman Act was passed for one goal only, to redistribute earnings from large stores to smaller companies. You know, they say basically have to offer the same price. This is huge efficiency losses. Of course it does. We lose economies of scale, but it has a clear goal, which is a redistributive goal to say, okay, I want to have smaller firms to compete in the same hand. Then what comes, the antitrust efficiency only mantra stops enforcing the Robinson-Patman Act, and it's still in the books. The books are there. Like they tried to repeal the law 5 times. They failed all 5 times, which shows there's clear political will, and then no one enforces it. So then we say, okay, we don't want efficiency. It's not the role of antitrust authorities to determine politics. But then many times politics comes in, gives a clear direction, and then we just don't follow it because we say, no, guess what? It's against efficiency. So I think we need to acknowledge as an antitrust community that efficiency is the key driver. We all want bigger economic growth. We all want a bigger pie. But at some level, we're going to have to give up efficiency for other values. And this exactly one of them is political power. Another one might be sustainability as well. And this is okay. Like we will survive if we don't have efficiency as the only so narrow driver of antitrust policy for every single area of the economy. It's going to be okay.
Just a quick comment about the drivers of antitrust. So actually, I have written way too much about consumer welfare and the history of the standard, way too much. And this is, the phrase is used in the United States in a particular way that is not applied in the same way in other countries. And it is true that it came in the 1960s, consumer welfare meant allocative efficiencies. As it has been practiced in the United States for more than 20 years, consumer welfare means low prices and other aspects that can be quantified. And the only reason is because we can actually analyze it as opposed to speculate about it. It's not about efficiency. It is true that in many mergers, efficiencies as defense was excessively promoted, but as it is actually practiced in the United States is where can we find harm? Can we actually identify the harm? Now, with respect to Robinson-Patman Act, actually to the progressive nature of antitrust today, which is by highly privileged individuals who came from wealthy families, who are highly educated, the notion that we can sacrifice low prices and convenience in sake of other things in a period of inflation, this is inspiring. It will not win any election. And in my little mind, I really don't like people lecture me that high prices are better because there are other things. Actually, people who have real jobs and are struggling financially, they want low prices. Now, there are many reasons to put constraints on efficiencies and other things. For me, democracy is number one. There are many other things for which we have regulatory system. But the general abstract thing, we should sacrifice efficiencies. What it actually means in antitrust, it's okay to have higher prices. It's okay to have less convenience because we have other goals. If you really care about democracies, ask those people who actually struggle to pay bills, whether they are willing to pay high prices. And the outcome will always be that these claims will lose election. They have always lost, and they will continue losing election.
I think it's also impossible to square the notion that we have an inexorable influence of business on government that's corrupting the process. And to assert that the failure to repeal Robinson-Patman is a function of democratic legitimacy or something. I guarantee you that there are very powerful interests who are interested in Robinson-Patman not being repealed, and it would be a mistake to suggest that somehow the failure to do so reflects democratic will, and big business is just interceding and harming everyone, because frankly, if you could really frame the question correctly and ask people generally if you'd rather pay lower prices or you'd rather have small pharmacies be protected against Walgreens, I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of them would say, yeah, lower prices sounds better than having a pharmacy on the corner in addition to Walgreens, and the law would be repealed in a heartbeat. But there are interests that are not necessarily the largest companies in the world and in the most concentrated markets that have a very strong interest in ensuring that Robinson patent continues to exist. Actually, the biggest one is plaintiffs' lawyers, but there are others too.
I don't know if you want to respond to that before we move on to the next topic.
Sorry, me? Yeah, I mean, again, I don't disagree, but I think that sometimes there is a...
You do disagree. Can I just say that?
In some parts I disagree, in some parts I don't. I just feel that, like, of course people want to pay lower prices, but antitrust is politically popular. It's like the Biden administration is running on an antitrust platform saying we need to increase antitrust enforcement, and they're doing well. So the notion that, like, somehow if you're going to ask everyone, is like, I don't know if maybe they like the next door pharmacy. And then that's why, I mean, one of the things that I think comes out of my paper that this, I think, is really well documented is guess what? Antitrust, every time people are asked about antitrust, they want more enforcement. So who are we to impose on them and say, you want more enforcement, but guess what? What you really want is really low prices and we have to enforce less. It seems like you're accusing me of being paternalistic. It seems very paternalistic from your side.
But I think it's a really good example of the countervailing forces besides, sort of big business that are out there. The notion that, I mean, if people really think that antitrust enforcement is going to benefit them, it's because they've been convinced or they've been told that it's going to, for example, on the right, it's going to take down those evil left-wing technology companies that they hate. And on the left, well, actually, it's probably the same bogeyman that they don't like. But I don't think that it's exactly why you want a technocratic regime here, and you want a system of enforcement that you've said you agree with this, but we're not doing antitrust enforcement by referendum. But it also means that it's just not very compelling to me to say that the Biden administration is running on this platform. I mean, the reasons they could be doing that are manifold, and they are not necessarily because they have tapped into the actual will of the people and they somehow know what's going to be best for them. And it's not just a matter, and to the point in that you and others have made, that somehow the sort of Chicago approach to antitrust is just a sort of defense of big business masquerading as a sound theoretical approach is it's bullshit. I mean, there is actually a very sound theoretical approach, and if it happens that big business is at times aligned with that approach relative to the other, it doesn't mean that the other approach was better, or that in this case big business is inherently wrong. I mean, just because something was one way doesn't mean that it should be that way. It is arguably the case that we should have less enforcement. All of the things that people hate about the consequence of Chicago antitrust, no one has established that things were somehow better before, especially in I mean, when you just look at the state of economics, of the economy, things were better before, and that somehow they're so much worse now. I mean, it's just not correct.
What is the new Chicago, right?
Yeah, the new Chicago is different. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm so happy to disagree with Jeff. So I think that Chicago, I never thought that Chicago was particularly sophisticated. I thought it was excessive.
Crazy.
No, that's what said. Okay, but it is. I thought it is simplistic, but these are fair disagreements. Okay, this is really fair disagreement.
Simplistic?
Oh, okay, let's put it.
The caricature of it is simplistic.
Side note.
Tell that to
that's the real point I wanted to make is actually the bipartisan coalition, which actually I have studied. In the United States, the promotion of the new antitrust ideas we have bipartisan coalition. So the drivers of these bipartisan coalition initiatives are progressives. It would be incorrect to associate Biden with any of that. Those of you who do not know, Biden has been around for quite some time. He has never been known for his interest or passion for antitrust. Try to find something he said about antitrust. He has his political calculus. Now, the coalitions themselves, the Republicans that align with the progressive on that, are literally anti-democratic forces. These are those who actually support the January 6th insurrection. If you align yourself with, from my perspective as a person who really care about democracy, if you think that aligning yourself with anti-democratic politicians in the sake of democracy, in the sake of whatever idea you have makes sense, I think that you take a huge risk, because perhaps they understand that your bill can be used in a different way that you think about it. And this is one of the key concerns. Why do you align with anti-democratic forces if you really care about democracy? But so
I was wearing my Josh Hawley sucks t-shirt.
But just a final comment. It's just that this conversation is very West focused, but we are in Europe. We are increasing antitrust enforcement here. We are passing laws to like the DMA. We are passing laws in Germany and other countries. We are increasing the budgets of regulators. We're hiring people. And this is not by the ultra-right anti-democratic system. I agree with you again. I think we agree in a lot of areas here. It's like, I don't like to have January 6 supporters supporting the antitrust bill. But
diversity here. So first of all, I'm going to give Paco the last word, because one point I do want to sort of say, and then I'm going to open up to the audience. So Paco, one thing I just do want to sort of emphasize is obviously we're talking a lot about giving more power to antitrust enforcement agencies or to the state. How do we think about that? Do we not have to then sort of, ensure that that antitrust agencies, that's the state itself, that they're subject to some sort of, oversight?
I think it's good to have Commissioner Canedo here. That's one of the topics I think she touched upon on her presentation. But for me, it's simple. Competition authorities regarding the state and places like Spain, where we have so many distortions of competition that comes from the regions, the municipalities, or the state itself. Things of everything like the hammer looks to a nail. So problem, you have the Bank of Spain gets together and pushes banks to agree and put a limit in the interest rates of deposits. What should we do? Should antitrust play a role there? In my opinion, no. Probably Commissioner Canedo disagrees, and she will file a dissenting opinion. She has filed so many. Does that mean that what the Bank of Spain is doing is right? No, obviously no. It may be even corruption, or I don't know. There may be other tools that can tackle these kinds of distortions of competition. In the US, they have a long tradition of fighting against these things through other tools, or the state action doctrine and things like that. But I think the problem here is that, and especially, I mean, you have a problem there. Like if you find the Bank of Spain, who's going to pay the fine? All of us. And who's going to find? A politician is going to find another politician, because some of these technocrats are only politicians. So, and we have had a few examples of cartels in which the public administration was involved. Part of the, they thought they were doing something else there. What do you do? Obviously, we have to do something, but I think the tool is not competition law. I think it has to do criminal law or corruption or anything like that. But anyway, and so, but that's only my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. What do you think about that? You agree, yeah? That's good.
All right. On that note of agreement, I'm going to throw it open to the floor. I think we had a question there. Okay. Do we have any other questions or comments or thoughts from the audience? Filippo?
A question for all of the panelists. I think there's a distinction to be. Thank you. There is a distinction, well, to be made, I think, between the fact that antitrust is by nature politics, and the fact that you may use antitrust for the purpose of being elected, right? So there's a Latin word for that anyway. And Lina Khan actually, in one of the footnotes of her famous paper, actually makes the point that antitrust should be used for the purpose of seeking elections and, important positions. So now my question is, what do you think on the panel? Would you agree that it's okay to use antitrust for the purpose of seeking elections and, nice government positions? Or would you oppose that?
So it is interesting, the reference to Lina Khan. So when I look at the visible individuals in the United States today, just such as Lina Khan, I frankly don't know whether they believe what they say or not, because politically it's just very shrewd. And Kanter would be a good example that until the wind changed direction, he felt very comfortable to be a fancy defense attorney. So is it legitimate? Not in my mind. I really prefer technocrats who want to distinguish themselves by being professionals and being admired within their professional circles, but then individuals who are appointed as political appointees and their entire aspirations are political and their expertise is political. I just don't trust these individuals, regardless of their political affiliation, right, left, middle, anything. I like technocrats who really want to be respected by other technocrats and will be evaluated as technocrats.
I certainly wouldn't prohibit it in the sense, at least in the US, where it would be a stark violation of the First Amendment to do so. But I don't think it's, I wish that it weren't happening, I suppose, because I do think that it does introduce this further sort of web of connectedness between government and business, in particular in an area of regulation that is really, it's not filtered through some other objective like the EPA is or the FCC is or something. I mean, it is just sort of like a pure economic consideration, and the more it becomes politicized, the more it will be politicized, the less democratic it will look. So I mean, there's a great point about lean economy. You sort of look at the way she's seems to be sort of running the agency. I think it's very consistent with what she has said in papers and other places. I don't think it has the same sort of regard for the agency as an institution. And I think that's probably bad for antitrust. I mean, even as someone who generally wants less enforcement, I'd actually like to have an effective and sort of robust FTC. And I'm not sure that that's what you'll get when you have when you sort of turn it into a platform for electioneering. And that's unfortunate for people who do care about antitrust, I think.
Filippo, I don't know if you want to come in. I mean, what do we think, maybe not about using the word antitrust, but what about the language of something like fairness? I mean, we have,
I think
VP Vestager does that a lot. She tries to communicate, concepts of fairness. Is that something that's more legitimate?
I think it's a great question. I think we have to separate two processes, So there's retail antitrust policy. There's like, should this merger be decided in this way or another? This, I totally agree. Antitrust is better off as a technocratic system where you evaluate the evidence, you look at cases, you look at what is going to be the impact on the market and all of these. And it should continue to be. This was a conquest. Some policies are better off, like monetary policy. They want to have referenda on mergers the same way they want to have referenda on interest rates. And you don't want to have, I don't even think that you want to have election for antitrust officials like have for state attorney generals, for example. I think this would be a bad decision. You do have, antitrust is fundamentally a complex policy that involves complex trade-offs, and you have a risk of mob populism just going after large companies, and this would be bad. I think the retail question is, should antitrust be litigated on whether we're going to approve or disapprove the Siemens-Alstom merger? I would say no, this would be really bad for antitrust. At the same time, if you see antitrust, the exact definition or the scope of antitrust policy as a fundamental trade-off between efficiency and distribution, right? So how much you want to grow the pie versus how much you want to reallocate the pie. And this is the way that you give your technocratic enforcers directions to say like, oh, we think that you have under-enforced on merger, you have to be much more strict now because, I don't know, the labor share of profits is going down, you want to have workers receiving more profits. Then antitrust should be, I mean, I hope it is something that politicians run on, because that's what we want them to do. We want them to ask people through elections, like, do you want, in a way, a bit more growth, a bit more distribution, things like this. And antitrust policy is part of this trade-off. It is tax policy is part of this trade-off. Trade policy is part of this trade-off. And so yeah, in this sense of like the broader definition of the scope, I think that we've seen this. Like, you look at the US history, it was for a very long time. And now it's coming back. And I think that's a good thing.
But don't we have the constraint of courts? And because you talk about Lina Khan as if she was winning any case in courts, she's losing all of them. So what's the point?
Yeah, no, but I think this goes to Filippo's point, and here I'll agree with Filippo that the sort of the danger that I'm describing, that I'm attributing to Gabriel Coco, but I think Tocqueville probably said it first, or at least prior to him, and I know Bob Higgs has said this. I mean, it's this relationship between business and government that is problematic. And I don't mean that at the retail level. I don't mean that Lina Khan is winning cases and bringing bad cases and winning the bad cases. It's more of, you know, opening the door to, it's the rhetoric, it's the way that she approaches the agency as a sort of political tool, more so than a technocratic one, which isn't to say that, I mean, we should be careful. I mean, just sort of, if not by law, by custom at the agency, she's doing on a daily basis tons of stuff that's purely technocratic. It's not, but she's still creating an environment that I think is sort of poisonous, but it's not because of the sort of specific cases.
All right, we have another question over here.
Hi, yeah, just I'm curious because now we're talking a lot about politics related to the economy, and I think, as you say, that's pretty clear that relationship's there. I mean, but it's a general issue in society, isn't it? I mean, we talk about Citizens United in the United States. We talk about this general. So my worry is that you could think about it as an antitrust issue, but can you really make a dent in it, even if you really went after it with antitrust? What would this? It sounds good to say that we should make it antitrust, and we almost feel good that when we say it, but what really would occur? What does this world look like in the future where people really think that antitrust is going to solve this issue? What would that look like? I just don't see how that's going to work. Filippo.
No, I
make it work.
Yeah, no, I think that we know in part how to make it work. We know in other parts we don't know how to make it. Like, we are hosting the Stiglitz Center, which I'm affiliated. We are hosting a conference in 3 weeks where the main topic is exactly how can we think about alternative antitrust standards that are enforceable and administrable? Because you don't want to have open, you don't want to give even technocratic enforcers full power to decide whatever they want, because there's an incredibly high risk of capture, of misappliance, of anything. This would be, I think, in many ways anti-democratic. So I don't think we have right now a solution that says, like, what we should do is we should have this standard and this is the area. And this goes back to my comment that we still don't know very well at exactly what level does market concentration or just market size, let's put it like this, like maybe it's a gigantic conglomerate. They get too much political power in a sense that it becomes problematic. So we don't have the standard yet. I don't think we have the answer. I'll say that that's fine. I mean, between the first terms of the University of Chicago about price theory in the 1950s and the big change in policy in the 70s and 80s, it took 30 years, to build the standards. We are in the beginning of a process of realignment that's still going to take some more time, and we are not there yet. At the same time, I think that in some areas, again, media is one area where you want to have media diversity requirements, exactly because you don't want to have what happens in Russia, where guess what, there's only one media, and then if people say we're running a special operation, we're running a special operation for the whole country. So in some areas which are very large, important, you might want to have different standards. And the things like you had this in the past, right? So in the US, you had standards on media diversity that were weakened over time. And then I cannot say that much about European countries. So I'll say, like, we don't know yet exactly where to go. I think that we're trying to figure out, but I wouldn't say that this means that the inquiry is a illegitimate or bad inquiry by definition. No, it's something that we're going to have to respond.
Yeah, I do think that part of it is, I think we touched on this earlier, the sense that we have these democratic institutions that are dysfunctional right now, and that it turns out antitrust laws are really vague, and that we can then use them to do all of the things that we can't actually do in the more democratic. But we can't get legislation passed, but hey, we can certainly write a rule at the FTC. There's no authority in the statute for the Labor Department to do anything about non-compete clauses, but I can certainly find a way to read that into the FTC Act. And I think that there's this sense that I can't say is completely wrong, I will say it's wrong not to, for the reason I said before, not to change the institutional environment and just think, oh, we can just change the objectives of the institution. But to point out that the Congress is dysfunctional and to say, well, look, if we're going to do something, here's a place where we can do it. It's not wrong. I just, of course, think that it's a bad idea. But for other people, I don't know. It's not crazy.
I just want to answer a question by tying the points that Jeff and Filippo made. Is The good thing of being a part of the antitrust community is that people really enjoy talking with each other. These agreements are fantastic. But when you are an agency person, your duty is to make sure that the institution you leave the institution in a better health than you got it. And you have to be committed to the health of the institution. It was before you and it should be after you. And when your ideas start dismantling the institution, you do not satisfy your fiduciary duties. Change is always needed, always should be considered, always should be debated. But one of the concerns that I think that we see, at least in the United States, I'm as familiar with the organization Europe, is that you lose a lot of talent and you lose a lot of excellent traditions. And that should be a bad signal for any person who really care about the institutions. Advocate for ideas, but protect the institution.
Can I just, I fully agree as well. And I think that's connecting to your question is, we are in the antitrust community, and so we are used to thinking about antitrust policy and debating antitrust policy. But ultimately, you're totally correct that antitrust might be a terrible tool for many of these decisions. And the big push for the discussion on antitrust and political power is partially coming from the fact that we weaken campaign finance laws and other things. And then once these tools that were better tools got weakened, people started looking for alternatives, And the same thing on the labor side, right? So much of the labor discussion in the past, the labor debates were done by unions and other areas. And then as unions got weaker and weaker and weaker, labor policy got weaker, then people started looking, okay, what is the alternative? And then antitrust is, I agree with Jeff, antitrust is this gigantic cannon that impacts the whole economy. And these should tell you that you should be cautious and prudent when making changes. I think this is something that I totally agree. And then you should look for data. You should try to understand the data. You should have reasonable distinctions. And I think that people are trying to do this. I mean, they might get right, they might get wrong, but they're trying to react. Ultimately, antitrust enforcers are public servants, and they are trying to respond to what are popular dynamics. And all the discussions we're going to have today in this panel, with the sustainability panel, industrial panel, they're all connected to some form of popular demand for change. And I think it's important to recognize this as well. And if it's not going to be antitrust, it might be somewhere else. I mean, in some areas, hopefully, it will be somewhere else. In some areas, it's going to have to fall on antitrust, and that's why I said. And I guess we're going to have to find the best way to implement this with the tools that we have.
So I was just going to say, I thought that was an amazingly good question. And it's a great way to now take us into lunch, where we can sort of try and debate this further.
Coffee.
Oh, sorry, coffee break. Coffee break rather than lunch. Sorry, don't get too excited. But still, before we do sort of break for coffee, can everyone just join me in thanking the panel? I thought that was a really great debate, and I'm very pleased they were participating.